Sheets this morning saying that I would be addressing the nation. I'm not really going to be addressing the nation as such. Where when that happens, I usually speak from a continuous prepared speech. But I hope that a lot of what I have to say would be important enough to be considered the elements of an address. We, as the cabinet, met last Friday and Saturday. As our normal work days, actually, it was some people believe that a retreat is a fun time. You might have a bit of relaxation and fun in some retreats, but in this retreat, like others, what we actually do is sit and work on the details of our jobs, our assignments. As you may be aware, for quite some time now in COVID, throughout the COVID period actually, the cabinet has been meeting virtually. That was one of the good things that came out of us going digital before COVID, that the COVID disruptions did not affect the functioning of the cabinet. We met as normal, but virtually. So when we do meet together around a table and the whole cabinet together, it's a pretty unusual occasion in these times. So that is what happened on Saturday and Friday, where the full government, actually, not only the cabinet, but other members who are involved in the government were also there, because we are dealing with the operations of the government. I want this morning to begin by alerting the population to the facts of this situation as regards COVID. We have been under COVID stress for 2 years or more, I would say 2.5 years. And therefore it is understandable how eagerly many people in the population would welcome the opportunity to be relieved of the restrictions that were associated with COVID. The COVID response involved invasions of your personal life, the national operations, the border, all those things. But over time, as the virus became less dangerous or less effective in taking us to hospitals, we did a number of things involving removals of the restrictions. Yesterday was the opening up of what was the last visible and very personal response to COVID. That was the removal of the legal requirement to wear a mask. I must tell you that that brings some mental and physical relief, psychological as well, that it appears as though COVID is behind us. Nothing is further from the truth. We are still in the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to repeat that. Notwithstanding the fact that the restrictions have been removed, the virus is still around, it is still mutating, it is still creating variants, it is still dangerous, and therefore we are still in a pandemic. All that we would have done so far is to remove the restrictions that we had placed on ourselves in response to the threat of the virus. Whether that is the best requirement or not is open to discussion. But we must not take the position that the pandemic is over and therefore we could just go back to normal. It is not normal. As I speak to you now, we took a decision a few weeks ago based on our hospitalization in response to the virus and the spread of the virus amongst us. We took that decision to relieve ourselves of the removal of the mask. Interestingly enough, in the few weeks since we took that decision to make it effective yesterday, the information coming in is that the BA4 and the BA5 variants are in fact posing significant threats. They are in fact resisting the effects of the vaccination. They are in fact so structured. The virus is still responding as to evade the attempts of the vaccines to prevent it from spreading. And the BA.5 variant is in fact still a public health issue. And in many countries, it is causing problems akin to Delta, as frightening as that might be, while being as virulent as Omicron. So we took our decision to take the masks off. But just at the time that we've done that, the WHO, through its Director General, is advising that countries should remain masked. From the very beginning, we had taken the position that we would be guided by the science and we will follow the directions of the WHO. So we are now under caution from the WHO that we should remain masked. I would say to the Trinidad and Tobago population that even though that is the advice of the WHO, we take it as advice. We will not disregard it. We will observe our circumstances and the behavior of the virus. And if, as per our public health analysis of our situation and the potential of the virus, that the wearing of the mask as a compulsory response is required, in the near future, the government will not hesitate to return to the mandatory requirement for masking, because it is deemed to be one of the most effective ways to prevent the spread of the virus. The spread of the virus is still the assignment that we are aiming to prevent, and we are still in a pandemic, and the pandemic could still hurt us. In fact, as we look at the analysis of the situation, many people who took part in the vaccination program, meaning half of this country, and for those who were infected naturally and did not know and have to be added to those who built up some resistance to the virus, we always knew from day one that the vaccination program is not a permanent protection, is that the effectiveness wanes after a few months. So if you were vaccinated, even if you were boosted, after a period of months, the response of your body would have been weakened and you are open to be infected again. One of the peculiarities of the BA.5 variant is that, unlike Omicron, it appears to be getting down into your pulmonary system much faster and is associated with severe sore throats and so. But I will leave these details to the health department, who will come back to you on this. I am simply saying that we are still with the COVID challenge, and if we have to respond by masking again, we will have to do that. Currently, a number of countries are facing outbreaks of BA.15, mainly in Europe, and you may recall that it was from Europe that Delta came to us with a record of serious devastation. We will observe what is happening, and of course, we have taken the decision that we have taken because we have moved from a situation where our hospitals were almost at capacity at one stage. We had lost in one day 31 people, and now the reports are recently 0 persons dying and so on. So it warranted us relaxing our response, but it also requires that we remain extremely cautious and observant, and the health department will be doing that, and the government will take the advice as required as we go forward in the very near future or the medium term, because we cannot wish the virus away. I'm very pleased to see that very many people, even though it is not mandatory, many people are still taking the precaution of wearing the mask when they see themselves in close contact, particularly indoors and in close contact or in groups. Outdoors, the risk is considerably reduced, but we're also observing that some private sector entities are making the use of the mask a requirement for the workplace. I'm asking the population to cooperate, because cooperating there is sensible. It is not to punish or to spite or to stress you. It is to protect you from being infected. It is not secure enough to say that I was vaccinated, so therefore I am out of the woods. The effect of the vaccines would have been considerably reduced. The virulence of the new variant is strong. The hospitalization is increasing around the world, and we cannot expect that we will respond differently if we become heavily infected. So there's everything to be gained by slowing down or reducing the rate at which we are infected as a national population. If we become heavily infected and require hospitalization at a highly increased level, what we would have done is to go back to where we have come from. And we don't want to do that. So masking and all the other protocols ought to be observed, even though they are requests rather than orders through law. Let us be a cooperative population. Let us be cognizant of what is happening around us. Let us enjoy the benefits of the sacrifices we've made recently. And to keep enjoying those benefits, we have to keep reducing or eliminating ourselves from being infected. Right? So try and stay away from crowds. Protect yourself if you are in crowds. Be cognizant that you have a role to play in protecting yourself from a virus that could infect you again or infect you for the first time. And of course, if you have any kind of comorbidity, consider yourself even more at risk and take your personal actions to protect yourself and your family. The Ministry of Health will come back to you on greater details of this, and we will continue to keep you informed as we have done through the COVID experience. The second thing I want to touch on is the issue of the dramatic escalation in criminal conduct in the country. We have always had crime. We've had increased levels of crime. We have had and have been experiencing in recent times inordinate levels of crime. And then in most recent times, we are seeing the brazenness, the bold-facedness, the impunity with which certain criminal elements are operating, largely with the use of firearms and through the organizations of gangs and hired killers in our community. I've seen it said that I did summon the Commissioner of Police to the Cabinet retreat. That is not really correct, and I want to correct that now, because I don't want at a later stage for persons to say that the Commissioner of Police was brought into a political environment and instructed to do his job by the Cabinet. That is not what happened at all. I was working here on Friday and Saturday, and I wanted, as head of the National Security Council, to meet with the police and the Defense Force at the earliest. And the earliest opportunity I could have met with them was one of those days when I was here in the retreat. I took time out from the retreat and I went with the National Security Minister and other elements of national security, and I met with them in a separate place, in a separate room, in my capacity as chairman of the National Security Council, and we discussed the security agency's response to what was happening, and certain decisions were made, much of which I cannot disclose with you in public, but except to say to you that I am satisfied that the police service and the Defense Force and the SSA, which are all the team that is focusing on what is happening with us, are at work. There are some actions to take place, and there are actions taking place, and we will continue so to do. As long as these developments are taking place, they are simply confirmations that we are not getting the upper hand of those who have chosen crime and criminality as a way of life, or of earning the income that they desire. The police service, present in the meeting by the Commissioner of Police, who reported on what they were doing and what will be done, the Chief of Defence Staff, who has his men and women on involved or on standby for further action. But one thing I would want to state, there are two things that I can mention. One is that the police is convinced that the upsurge in criminal conduct and the ability of persons to arm themselves and challenge the state and upset the population in the way that is happening is supported by some shortcomings on the part of the state with respect to the availability of sustained funding for the criminal element through the use of state resources, not the least of which is illegal quarrying, which is funding a lot of criminal activity and spurring the fight for turf and for resources. And the state is going to take the relevant action to ensure that these facilitations are curtailed and eliminated. I did say recently that with respect to breaking the cycle and stemming the flow of new recruits into the criminal element and the flush of criminal behavior from our young people who form significant parts of these minorities that are terrorizing the country, that to break that cycle, that it is the government's intention to declare violent crime as a public health issue, because violence across the society is now the norm, from domestic violence, violence in schools, violence person against persons, armed responses for everything, and of course the gains to be had by criminal conduct where lives are lost and property being destroyed and stolen and so on. It's a whole plethora of violent, unacceptable conduct. This matter, we have started to work on that. Again, having said that, we will focus on it as a public health issue, even before we have been able to flesh it out and to present it to the country as to what actions we take. By the very mention of it, I have seen comments that I as Prime Minister have no competence or training to make any comment like that. But I will ignore that, because as head of the government, my job is to get the advice from the proper sources and to put the relevant people to work. And having said that, I can tell you that the elements of the public service are already at work. Discussions have started and documents will be prepared. The intention is to have, in the context of this issue being raised in this way, that we develop a national plan of action. And that plan of action would be driven by a public health approach. And that approach would involve the defining of the problem. I have simply mentioned that there's a problem. Acknowledge that there's a problem. And if there's a problem, we'll define it. We will identify the causes and the risk factors. We will design a response, and we will test the interventions that we are going to make, and we will implement and scale up the effective interventions and support continuous evaluation. The objective here is to enter the youth population at various levels and to begin a line of education which should steer people away from participation or being desensitized by crime and criminal activity. We believe that if we do that effectively, we would begin to generate a wave of people who will reject crime or be in a position to respond to it from the personal, through the home, through the school, into the wider community. In short, preparing a better citizenry. And in so doing, that approach of so identifying violence and violent crime, we will then be creating a society in which that component would be significantly reduced towards the aim of elimination. To do that, and to continue, the team that is going to do this would be headed by the permanent secretaries co-chaired by the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, and the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health. These two permanent secretaries will co-chair this exercise, which will be overseen from the Office of the Prime Minister and would involve the Ministry of National Security, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, the Ministry of Sport and Community Development, the Office of the Prime Minister, the Ministry of Education, and the Tobago House of Assembly. So, some members of this team are already at work. Some documentation will be ready in the form of an action plan, and the wider team would be free to co-opt experts and to do whatever has to be done so that this aspect of our dislocation would be effectively addressed. I can tell you that even though this is being raised by me now, it is not a brand new concept or concern. What we are doing now is operationalizing a response to what is in effect a crisis. This matter has found its way onto the agenda of Caricom and I dare say PAHO, and there are efforts being made to ensure that countries respond in the way we are responding here in Trinidad and Tobago, that we are a bit out front on it. Caricom has discussed and has raised and is organizing for there to be a meeting sometime in the not too distant future in Barbados, where Caricom countries will pool our resources and focus on this issue. By the time that comes around, we expect that Trinidad and Tobago would be in a position to indicate where we are at and what progress we have made or are making. The Minister of Health and the various the PS teams and the experts who they would have drawn in would advise the public further and engage the public further in the not too distant future. One other item I want to touch on very briefly, just again for the benefit of the public that could be misled. I know it has been said very frequently, especially from members of the media who again might be talking to people who are not fully seized of the facts. It has been said also from political quarters that the government has an interest in not proclaiming the procurement legislation, and that the government is deliberately dragging its feet on that. For those who know what I have been doing as Prime Minister and my view on this matter, they will tell you that nothing is further from the truth. As a matter of fact, the government on many occasions have indicated some date by which the proclamation would take place. And whenever you would have seen that, it would have been because I would have been on the back of the Minister of Finance and the AG office, the legislation having been passed and amended and adjusted on numerous occasions. I am anxious for this to be done, if only that it would not be said that the government is in fact benefiting from not having legislation like this in place. Some people believe that there is no procurement legislation. That is not true. There is procurement legislation. That's why I have a Central Tenders Board and other regulations in the Exchequer Act. What this legislation is new and expanded procurement legislation. That's what it is. What has been happening is that every time we attempt to proclaim this law, elements, I should say interested parties and clients, will point out pitfalls. And we come back to the Parliament and we adjust it. But there always seems to be some problem, because this is a very far-reaching piece of legislation which could have serious consequences to the operations of the government and of the state. Some people believe that it's a panacea for all things corrupt. I don't believe that. Many people don't believe that. As a matter of fact, it has the potential to assist in corruption if you want to be corrupt. But the bottom line is that you will have legislation to deal with the corrupt action in the event that it takes place. And up front, it has operations that should direct the state's operations and the private sector operations with the state away from corrupt action. The very last disappointment I've had is that just as we were about to proclaim it on this very last attempt, it happened to have been the time when a new Attorney General came into office, completely separate and apart from this. One of the first assignments I gave that Attorney General was to ensure that we are in a position to have this piece of legislation proclaimed, because we had come to the point where we think we had dotted as many T's and crossed as many I's and so on. In carrying out that instruction, the new Attorney General did a quick review of the interested parties, the judiciary, and the procurement office of the regulator. Out of that has come some significant comments which call for caution with respect to the proclamation of the Act as it is now. For me, that is disappointing, but it cannot be disregarded. You would have heard the Attorney General say that the Chief Justice, the Office of the Chief Justice, has presented, I think it's a 6-page commentary on the existing legislation as it exists now, even after it has passed through the Parliament on so many alterations. That being so, it would be irresponsible of me and the government to disregard what has been identified by the Chief Justice, and of course what is being also considered by the Office of the Regulator, notwithstanding how eager we are to have it proclaimed so that we can once and for all put this on the books. So there's going to be a little delay, but it is not because we want to delay it. It is because we want to respond to what has been identified as pitfalls with far-reaching consequences. And as soon as the Attorney General is in a position to address those, he will inform the country, in Cabinet, the Parliament and the country, and we will move with the reasonable haste to get it put on the books. That is where we are with procurement legislation. So I will disregard comments aimed at me and even the government that we don't want to do it because it's somehow benefiting us. That is not so at all. It's a piece of new legislation which is very complex, which we could proclaim it as is. But to do so knowing that there will be these problems pointed out to us by the offices, especially the Office of the Chief Justice, is to find ourselves at a later date being accused of being irresponsible. So that will come in the very near future, and the Attorney General would be the point at which you can get further information going forward, and I ask you to stay in touch with the AG office for any further clarification which you may need on the timetable or the actual issues that are in fact causing this hold-up. The other issue that we spent a lot of time on in this 2-day work program we had last weekend is the economy. Because of course the economy is the lifeblood of our activities in the country. The Minister of Finance was required to make, and he did make, a significant presentation to the Cabinet on the financial situation of the country. And these things are not done in a vacuum. It has to be done against the background of what we were dealing with, what the outcome of our actions are, and what is the prognosis for the future. And this graph, which you all may be familiar with, is the pathway that we have been on for quite some time. This valley you see here, this is where we started out as a government. This government, the previous administration of this government, we started out here. And our responsibility as a new government was to get this turned around, stabilize the country's economy, and get this calamitous pitfall that you saw here. 2015 September here, and these curves going up here were telling us that we were going in the right direction, climbing out of this trough. The numbers there would have shown us that our gas and oil revenue at the bottom here was $7.6 billion. That's what it was, as a result of volume and marketplace. And of course, the numbers you'd see here, 11 billion, 14 billion, 23 billion, just before 2020. We were going up and out on the right position. Then this downward here, that's COVID, where we dropped down here to 15 billion, and by 2022, we are up here at 38 billion. So that's the pathway we've been traveling. But to have traveled that pathway and to have stabilized the economy to be able to do that, this graph is another presentation that the Minister of Finance made, and it shows how we were able to do that. You would have seen here, this is 2018, going down the trough here, where our deficit was 5.7 billion. 2019, 4.3 billion. And the projection for the next year was about 3 billion, and we were moving towards a balance in our budget. Up comes COVID, and our deficit jumped from 4 billion to 16 billion. Not telling you anything about anything new here. You knew, we told you, we had to make significant borrowings. And the difference between earnings and expenditure at the height of COVID here, 2020, 16.6 billion. 2021, 13.4 billion. And projected for 2022, 3 billion. So it's a nice curve here to have climbed down from the deficit of 16 billion to just under 4 billion. But remember, that deficit is not money in hand. It is the difference between earnings and expenditure. Our earnings have improved considerably in the 2022 period, end of 2021, 2022, and that is why our deficit is going to be better. The Minister of Finance will speak to the country in detail at what we call a spotlight on the 2nd of August on all the details of the country's finances, where we've been, where we are, where we're going, what we didn't earn, what we borrowed, what we are going to spend, and how we're going to spend it. The Minister of Finance has been instructed by the Cabinet, so you could put that in your diary. August 2nd, there'll be a comprehensive presentation of the country's financial situation by the Minister of Finance. And of course, in those discussions of the economy, there are certain parameters, perimeters, yardsticks that jump to the fore to give you a flavor of what the economy is doing. One of it is inflation. Everybody is concerned and is aware and is being affected by inflation, which means increase in the cost of goods and services, increasing the prices of everything. Trinidad and Tobago, the level of inflation, even during that period that I just showed you is those two graphs. One of the things that we were successful at in stabilizing the economy was keeping inflation low. Our inflation was approaching 1% at one stage. It was 2 and 3%, which was very good for a developing country in the kind of crisis that we were in. Of course, I don't expect our detractors to say so, but we will say so ourselves. It was a very good job in maintaining inflation at that level going forward and aiming towards a balancing of the budget. External circumstances, including a pandemic and other things, came and disrupted that direction, and we'll talk about that in August 2nd. But the bottom line is, even now, the levels of inflation in Trinidad and Tobago is considerably less than it is in other countries which are in fact facing the same kinds of challenges that we are facing. Inflation in Trinidad and Tobago today is just over 5%, largely driven by increase in the cost of food items, the cost of fuel, and also the cost of construction materials. Those are the things that have driven our inflation to 5%. But even so, at 5%, we are in among the small number of countries where inflation is 5% or less. Maybe across the whole of Europe, inflation is well above 7% and upwards of 10%. In the United States, it's 9.1%. And in some developing countries, inflation could be 15–20%. Right? So at inflation at 5%, while we would have preferred for it to be lower, but it is not disastrous as compared to what it is and could have been had we mishandled the economy in certain ways. So the Minister of Finance will give you all that data, and including how we are treating with it and what we're going to be doing to treat with persons who are most affected by the inflationary pressures. And that brings us to the point of the reserves. I'm sure you would have read from some experts along the way since 2015, either those who are advising the government or those who are advising the public, that if we didn't do this and if we didn't do that, and among the things to do, devalue the currency, lay off public servants, and so on and so on. If we didn't do that, we would dry up the foreign reserves in some given period of time. There's one particular economist who gave a special time when the reserves will run out and the country will become a failed state and become a pariah and so on. All of these are parts of the national conversation. What are the facts? The fact is that even after all these difficulties, all that we've been through, all that we're going through, Trinidad and Tobago still has a substantial cache of foreign reserves, and we have foreign reserves well beyond the minimum that is expected in a country well managed, and we have foreign reserves for 7 months of import cover, where 4 months is the usual yardstick to say whether you are in or out of trouble. We have maintained import cover for up to 7 months, notwithstanding all that you would have heard from all of those for whom the conversation always is how bad things are in Trinidad and Tobago. And even as we've taken steps to be able to do that, there are some rectification steps that we have had to take, not the least of which is the reduction in the amount of money we spend subsidizing fuel. Even after that, you would hear people saying, one, incorrectly, that we have removed the fuel subsidy. We have not removed it. We have reduced it. Had we not reduced it, we would have been in a much more difficult situation on other parts of the swing or the merry-go-round. But having reduced it, what exactly are we dealing with? We're still, because the price of oil has become so high in recent times, we are currently committed and are paying $300 million a month and growing in fuel subsidy. Had we removed the fuel subsidy, as is being said by some people, that would have been $300 million that would have been available to do other things. But because of how we have chosen to manage the oranges in the basket, who gets what out of the basket, what we have allocated for support on the fuel price side is $300 million a month. Multiply that by 12, that is $3.6 billion for the year. Yet you will hear the mischievous or the misinformed saying that the government has removed the fuel subsidy and has thrown the population to the wolves. That is not true. The question is, how much of what we have available are we going to spend on the fuel subsidy? Because if we don't restrict the subsidy, the additional earnings that we are having now because of our involvement in selling fuels and so on, oil, more of it will have to be spent on the fuel subsidy. But the fuel subsidy is not the only place that the government has serious responsibilities to find money to fund. I just showed you where we found the money to fund our existence through the COVID. Borrow billions of dollars. Now that the market is giving us some additional revenue, unplanned, But fortunately, we are grateful to have that. The Minister of Finance was able to tell us that for the period that we are examining, up to this very current period, we would have earned an additional $8.14 billion. So let's say loosely $8 billion. That is monies that we got as a result of the improvement in the marketplace, additional revenues. What do we now do with that money? And that is what the discussion in the retreat was about. A lot of it was about that. How do we manage that? But even before we sat down to do this apportionment, we had already gone to the Parliament and spent $2.6 billion of that when we adjusted the budget. Because the first budget had a certain figure. By the mid-year, because of commitments that the government had to service, and because we got this additional revenue, we went to the Parliament and we committed from the 8.14 billion, 2.67 billion, and so that is gone in terms of commitment and spending for that way. It went to the Parliament and you were told exactly what it was spent on and so on. So that leaves us, if we use the figure of 8 billion for easy computation, we spent 2.5 billion, right? That leaves us with another 5.5 billion, right? Question now, what do we do with that? How much of that 5.5 billion do we spend on back pay to public servants and fuel subsidy? We offered public servants a 2% increase, and I need not tell you how that was received. But we can only offer what the country can afford. We opened the negotiations. Everybody knew that that was the opening of the negotiation, because the negotiations had pretty much stalled for a long time when we were in other situations. But at the first opportunity, the Minister of Finance indicated to the CPO to commence the negotiations. And the negotiations opened with the government's offer of a 2%. And of course, that was roundly condemned and dismissed. But what does that mean in dollars and cents? In the event that we had settled public servants at 2%, there was a figure. The Minister of Finance has since then offered, in the negotiations, an increase of 4% for a period under discussion. And if that 4% is accepted, we're talking about a back pay, an immediately payable back pay of 2.4 billion, which is roughly half of the increased revenue, if that 4% was in fact the figure. What that would do, if let's assume for argument's sake that that was the final position, it would add over and above the 2.4 billion in back pay that is payable immediately. It would add to the government's ongoing or its recurrent expenditure another $490 million going forward every year, additional to what is being paid. And the question is, what are we committing ourselves to? And of course, that is only for the public service as you know it. Because you know, once the public service back pay has been settled, it reflects itself through the public sector. Not just public servants on the gazetted sheet. The other people in the public sector, state enterprises and so on, they will all expect an increase of a similar nature. And if we add that to it, you're talking about another 1.5 billion on the back pay side, and another 300 million on the continuous payment side every year. So if you add those two things together, which is what's going to happen at an agreement, you're talking here about approximately $4 billion in back pay and approximately $800 million increase going forward. Now, if we are able to get that agreement and commit to that, there's a slight fly in the ointment, and that is the 8.14 billion that the Minister of Finance has reported is as a result of unusual developments in the hydrocarbon market sector. He did show us that, exactly where the increases came from. And the question that we have to ask ourselves as a people, do we commit ourselves to these huge expenditures permanently going forward and huge back pay to be paid from the known pool of revenue when tomorrow it is possible and more likely that these high prices that we are enjoying now are temporary? If you saw this morning's news, you would have seen that the action taken by the United States government at home and abroad has forced the price of gasoline down for the first time after a period. The price of gas is now falling in the United States. It's under $4 for the first time and under pressure to go lower. I told you when I spoke to you last that I was in California recently and I saw diesel advertiser gas stations in Central California at $8.80 a gallon. Those prices are coming down. Once those consumer prices are coming down as they are being forced down by the United States, the major user, it will automatically transmit itself out into forcing down the price of oil. So we have to view the high prices now as temporary. And the gains that we've made in terms of cash earnings as a temporary pool of cash. And therefore, I did ask the Minister of Finance to tell me what would happen. Let's, for argument's sake, say that the government's offer is 5 plus 5. Right? We talk about 2 plus 2, let's say 5 plus 5. What does that mean in dollars and cents? If perchance that is what the government is made to do or decides to do, we're talking here about increasing the government payroll to public servants by $1.1 billion a year, with a back pay of $5.8 billion. And if it goes across the quasi-public service, as I mentioned a while ago, the rest of the public sector, we're talking here about an increase of $2.2 billion added to go forward with a back pay of $11.6 billion. I tell you these numbers so that you could know when people talk about percent increase and percent increase, that percent by itself doesn't say anything. Know what it means in dollars and cents to understand what they're saying to you. Because I just mentioned to you here a 5 plus 5 with $11 billion in back pay. I didn't bother to calculate a 20% increase for the full period. But I do know that some of our labor leaders have been saying that nothing less than a 20% increase for one triennium is acceptable. Now, we have to understand what we are dealing with when we are receiving that kind of information. Because there's no way under the current revenue and earnings situation that the government of Trinidad and Tobago or the country of Trinidad and Tobago or the people of Trinidad and Tobago could undertake to make payments of this nature for 3 years, $11 billion in back pay with a forward motion of about $1.something billion. So these are just some of the discussions and some of the facts that the Minister of Finance was able to put before the cabinet, that these are what it means. This is what it means. And we will, on the 2nd of August, sorry, I kept saying 2nd of August. No. 2nd of September, sorry. 2nd of September, August, July is almost finished. My apologies. Thanks for advising me. It's the 2nd of September that the Minister of Finance will be making this presentation. So he will prepare it in the month ahead, and the population should pay attention and advise yourself to make the kinds of decisions indicate what you will support or will not support, but only after you have been properly informed on the facts of the situation. The anticipation with respect to our economy and our earnings is that there are two things. In fact, there are three things that are threatening the US law. One is the fall in the price of oil and gas in the international market where the price is set. Two, some conclusion or stalemate in the Ukraine war with Russia. And thirdly, the performance of the United States market. Because we do have our Heritage Fund invested in the assets of the United States market that are reported upon in the stock exchange. So when if you see any movement in the stock exchange, up, down, or across, picture our Heritage Fund in there responding accordingly, because that's where we earn our money in the HSF. So those three things we have to keep our eye on. And of course, the requirement to treat public servants, with some of it. It is our view at the level of the cabinet that a demand to pay the $5 billion that's available. Remember I told you that if we go 4% for the entire public service, the back pay will be $4.8 billion. That means all the money that we've earned in the period of good fortune, all of it will go to one group of people, which is the public servants. But as I said earlier on, the government has other responsibilities for the very public servants themselves in other expenditures. So with respect to the fuel subsidy in this situation, at $300 million a month, and the possibility of it going higher, the cabinet is taking a decision that we could, in providing assistance on the fuel side, and given the volatility of the market, we could set a cap as to how much we are prepared of the public earnings, extraordinary earnings, we will divert to supporting the fuel reserves. And we think that $1 billion for that is a reasonable amount out of what we have and is earning. And if the price moves above that, the user will pick up that difference. And if the price moves below it, then we all benefit. We expect that the price will not remain, but for the extent that it will remain, the government could undertake, out of the $5 billion, $1 billion for fuel subsidy. And please don't listen to anybody who's telling you that there's no fuel subsidy. And in that fuel subsidy, one of the biggest contributors to the government's charge in there is LPG. Every household in this country that uses LPG gets it at a reduced cost because the government subsidizes it. We have, outside of possibly Venezuela, we have the lowest cost for domestic fuel, LPG, in the region. And if you don't believe me, call up any friend or family in Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Dominica, Jamaica, ask them how much they pay for a 50-pound gallon of oil, LPG, or 100-pound gallon, and then your eyes will open immediately. That subsidy has never been touched. The government pays that subsidy in the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. But the reasonable question is, how much do we apportion? We decided not to touch LPG because of the fact that so many households, especially households in the lower income bracket, rely on LPG as their domestic fuel. Domestic fuel in any society is one of the yardsticks of poverty, whether you can or cannot have fuel. Some people use dried wood that they can't get. Some people use dried cow dung. Some people use LPG. Some people use electricity. So fuel at the level of the household is a major requirement if we are to preserve the quality of life that we have, and the government is committed to doing that. And while I'm dealing with the economy and closing off on that point, the expectation is that there will be an early budget. The Minister of Finance, in making all of these decisions flowing from the media review, the volatility of the market, the requirement to manage our affairs in the way I'm discussing here, we have an early budget, bringing the population into the picture and the Parliament as soon as we can. So anticipate an early budget. And next month, and let me get the month right, August, we have a number of events taking place in Trinidad and Tobago. One of it, on the 18th of August, Dr. Ian Alleyne, President of Guyana, will be making a state visit to Trinidad and Tobago on the 18th of August. And he is doing so on the eve of what is part 2 of the Caricom Agricultural Investment Forum that is taking place in Trinidad. That will take place on the 19th. So the day after the state visit commences, the 19th, we open the Agri-Investment Forum, which will take place in Port of Spain. It will involve some meetings at venues in Port of Spain and agricultural exhibition, a major agricultural exhibition at the Savannah, and it will involve Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the region on display, indicating what we are doing, what we intend to do, and the meetings hopefully will alert our investors to the possibilities, all in this major Caricom initiative to bring about increased production in Caricom, for Caricom, and to put us in a position of increased food security and also manage the food inflation and availability. So that very important meeting is taking place here on the 19th of August going forward, immediately after the state visit of the Guyanese president. Then we move immediately into our independence celebration. And this year, Prime Minister Holness has finally accepted our invitation to visit us. This is an invitation that has been extended since I made that visit to Jamaica early in my tenure. You may recall one of the first things I had to do as Prime Minister was to go to Jamaica and smooth some feathers with respect to a boycott that was brewing against Trinidad and Tobago's manufactured products, largely because of the mishandling of our affairs in our regional diplomacy. The invitation was extended then, and Prime Minister Holness has now accepted that he will come and visit us as our guest during our independence celebration. So he is due here for independence, and there will be the appropriate receipt of his arrival here, and he will accompany us through our celebrations. And thirdly, this year, Trinidad and Tobago, having attained its independence in 1962, this year, 2022, you do the maths and you'd realize that it's a milestone that we should pay some attention to. We have been doing so. We had a committee in place to see how we can, given the restrictions of COVID and the question marks that were over our head, we decided that we'll wait a little while to see what is doable and possible. We think that we are in a position, as we have just mentioned earlier on, to have removed some of our restrictions, and therefore our normal independence celebrations will take place. But we'll have additional activities which will involve art and culture, where we'll put on display as part of our 60th anniversary celebration some of the art treasures that we have at some of the houses in Trinidad and Tobago. And we intend, as part of our 60th anniversary celebration in art and culture, to have events of art and culture which the committee has put before the cabinet. On Thursday, the cabinet will approve the budget for what they plan to do, and you will see in the next few weeks what we are going to do, and it will involve activities around the country. And in the capital city, we'll put the art exhibitions of FCB and the Central Bank and Angostura on display for public viewing. And this exhibition and our celebrations will go into independence, continue with the activities straight through into Republic So the period of mid-August towards the end of September, we'll do a number of things in celebration of our 60th anniversary, and I think on Thursday, Minister Robinson Regis will be in a position, hopefully, to give you some more details on this as we go forward. The two things I want to close on before I open the floor to you. One is, I have seen it said by spokespersons for NTAC that Labour will not come back to NTAC unless their return is legislated or the activities of NTAC is legislated. I want to say to that suggestion that clearly that is not in keeping with what NTAC was supposed to be and will do. NTAC is supposed to be the meeting of the minds without restraint, but in protection of the interests of the sectors of government, business, and labor. I can't comprehend what the legislative force is going to be that will prevent one party from walking out if they believe that they were not taken seriously or not having their way or so on. I would like to appeal to Labour to return to NTAC without preconditions, and as the government would welcome them back without preconditions. And we all are better off if government, Labour, and business sit in a civil manner and confront the country's realities. If in that tripartite discussion there are people who are not prepared to face reality, then NTAC's contribution would be minimal. If, on the other hand, we are all prepared to confront reality and to see what we can all do so that we can all be better off, then it's useful. For example, there are laws that govern negotiations and contracts with labor. And if there is no agreement, there are processes, sometimes drawn out processes, that will govern step by step how you come to a conclusion. Those processes and those laws are in place and the negotiations are underway. The government has a responsibility. One of those responsibilities is not to bankrupt the country. The other one is to ensure that its public officers get a fair shake. And because we all know that for some considerable time, public officers have been under pressure because of what the government has had to do because of our national circumstances being changed, not for the better. I have just said that it is possible for the government to make half of the money that we have available from the increased earnings now, to make that available to public servants now. But that will have to be with the agreement of their leaders. Because if there is no agreement for that to be made available, then the process is going to have to go longer and later. Question is, are our public servants, citizens, better off without what is available now? Or are they prepared to wait until it finally comes to a conclusion at the end of a longer process and some other party makes the decision? But if NTAC was functioning, it might have been possible for us to have had a halfway, where what is available now could be made available now, as we await some final arbitration in a different place, at conciliation or wherever. But these are discussions, not for me to conclude. I just raised them to indicate to you how interactions can or cannot work. And the last point I want to make is to my friends in the Express. Who is here from the Express? You? Why are you disowning it? Who is here from the Express? Nobody? I know why. I read the Express editorial this morning As I told you all, I always read the papers. Whatever you write, good, bad, or indifferent, I am one reader you have. Because unlike the other people, I still get my news from the papers. There's an editorial in the Express today, which is an interesting editorial. And it deals with the whole question of some activity in the health system. And the editorial says that this problem could have been addressed if the government addressed, there's a huge elephant in the pasture in the health system. And that elephant is doctors in the health system, full-time, gazetted as public health doctors, but being allowed to conduct their private business while they are full-time on the public health system. That conflict, the editorial point out, was identified in the Welsh report. The Welsh report, the editorial pointed out, was an examination of the health system that I, as Prime Minister, as pointed out by the editorial, put in place and got a report early in the government's tenure. But then that's where the editorial lost its way. It said that the Welsh report identified this problem, and the editorial says the problem was identified, but Rowley balked. In other words, we saw the problem, but didn't have what it takes to address it. Didn't do anything about it. I don't want to accuse the editorial of having mischief as their motive. I simply want to tell them that it is possible for one to forget things. Not everything that comes or comes from you or to you, you will remember. Because I am sure if the writer of that editorial had remembered all the facts, they would have written in that editorial today that yes, early in the tenure of the government, one of the things we did was to examine the delivery of health care in the country. Dr. Welsh and I think 4 other doctors did a 2-part report. The first part was the general issues, and this particular issue, this nettlesome issue, was the second part of that report. The government then got the report. But because these matters are so fundamental and far-reaching, and because good governance requires certain actions, what did the government do? Well, I want to say to the editor of that report, Rowley didn't balk. As Prime Minister, who commissioned that report from the cabinet I led, and the report having been delivered, we took the report to the Parliament. That's what a good government does. And that's where this particular issue went, to the Parliament. And in the Parliament, a statement was made on it. And we as a country in the Parliament decided that the issue will now be dealt with by a joint select committee of the Parliament. Healthcare delivery in Trinidad and Tobago, to be addressed by a joint select committee of the Parliament. I didn't balk. The leader of the opposition refused up to this day to appoint members of the joint select committee to deal with the Welsh report. And I think the Express knows that. But if you are afraid to tell that to the country, I will tell the country the facts. The government put the Welsh report in the Parliament for adjudication by the Joint Select Committee of the Parliament, which would take a position on whether or not the country wants to continue with doctors being on the government payroll, but spending more time in their private practice or not turning up at all as part of the infractions that take place, or worse, that they conduct their private business in competition to the public health sector and use the public health sector to harvest patients for the private business at different and exceedingly high costs. That is what the Joint Select Committee of the Parliament was called upon to do. But the lovable opposition, that is not mentioned in the editorial today, took the position that they are not appointing members to a Joint Select Committee. And therefore you cannot have a Joint Select Committee without the opposition. If I cough as I'm being choked in my own spittle, the opposition accused me of being a dictator. I coughed. Because that's what they do. Every affirmative action that the government takes that is required to protect the public, you hear this talk about dictator. But I come to the Parliament with a report and ask you to participate on a fundamental matter like this. You choose not to participate because it will offend some doctors. And as a result of that, you undermine the parliamentary action of the Welsh report. And then the editorial is written today that Rowley balked, giving the impression that it is something that I was supposed to do and I didn't do, and completely ignoring the fact, not a line, not a paragraph, not a phrase, that it is in the Parliament, went to the Parliament, and it was undermined by an opposition that says it wants no part of that because it's a waste of time. So that was the opposition in the opposition. We had enough report on the health system. It's a waste of time, and therefore they're taking no part in the Welsh report. That's what it is. So whatever you all want to call my name, call it in the full context of my actions or inactions. I am not afraid of dealing with the consequences of my decisions in my public life or public service where I function. If you have any questions, I'll take them now.
Prime Minister, Jimmy Brown, TV6 News. Just a point of clarification, if you don't mind. When you talked about the $1 billion in terms of allocation towards the fuel subsidy, is that in the context of...
An approximation.
Right, okay, so the approximate number. Is that in the context of, because I did pose a question to you maybe a couple of months ago, whether there would be like a cap in terms of fuel price on the international market that could trigger lower prices locally at the pump. Is that part of it, or is it still being worked on?
Well, what I have said ought to be interpreted that as the price moves up and down, the government's maximum would be in the order of $1 billion. And therefore, what is computed as the price to be paid by the user will take that into account. If the price drops below a floor would also be set where the subsidy will not step in. For example, if the price drops to $30 a barrel, well, there may be no need for any subsidy. Because remember, the subsidy is climbing as the price climbs. But if it collapses, and remember, it collapsed at one time to $1. So you're going to have some kind of a floor as well as the government ceiling. Because the government can't put a price as the ceiling of the price of oil. You put a price at the ceiling at which you will support up to that level. And if it goes beyond that, hopefully, that will be for a short period or not at all. Because if the price falls back down to, say, $70 or $80, then the subsidy will drop considerably. And therefore, what we discussed, what I used this morning of $1 billion, $300 million a month, will fall well below that. When we did take the decision to continue some subsidy, we didn't anticipate a price of $120 oil. We are talking about oil in the order of $65, and therefore the government will pay this amount of manageable subsidy. But once the subsidy was in place and the price started to skyrocket, it pulls subsidy up with it. Okay?
Also as well, the issue of the refinery, because I would imagine some of the cost is concerning importation of fuel, while the refinery is still, of course, not functioning. Any update in terms of when the refinery could be back up and running?
There are two things you need to add when you talk about the refinery. One, the refinery refines something. The refinery refines crude oil. we, with an operating refinery at the time of closure, we were importing 120,000 barrels per day. Open your mind to that. 120,000 barrels per day of imported crude oil. And you pay for that in US dollars. And then when you refine it, you lose minimum 5, possible 7, as high as $15 a barrel. Now that was when oil was in the order of $70 or $80 a barrel. When oil is at $100 or $120, the loss per barrel is even higher. So do not speak about the refinery without speaking about the imported crude oil to be refined. And if you say that, well, we do have in Trinidad and Tobago 60,000 barrels at Heritage, ask yourself, what is happening with that? If that had gone into the refinery, it is to lose on refining what I just told you, between $5 and $15 a barrel. It's a US dollars, eh? But to sell it as crude oil, we are making a handsome profit. We are getting almost the price of Brent per barrel for our crude without engaging in a refining process to lose money. Put yourself as a businessman or woman or owner of a business with those options and tell me what your decision would have been. Understand? So when you discuss the refinery in isolation, as some people do, you come up with all kinds of decisions that are not in the public interest. But if you see it as part of the wider decision-making process, a reasonable person will see the government's actions as the best action. Because remember what we've done? We have not shut down our business in oil and gas. We have not shut down the oil company. We've shut down the refining operations. And that's where the misinformation generates, because people are refused, those who want to carry on the rara. We've shut down the refining operations because the economics of it were as I've just described. Now, we have been saying we make the refinery available more than once to any person or entity who has the ability to supply its own oil and need the equipment to refine. So far, we have been unable to do so. As I speak to you now, the last going out, the last request for proposal is on its last legs. Meaning, they got to the point of dealing with one company that seemed to have had some interest and some ability to do what they say they will do. Those discussions, unfortunately, have not yet been concluded, and also don't appear at this time to be very promising. So that being so, it is not going to be open-ended. Once the company determines that the people they're dealing with cannot come up with what they say they can come up with, we'll then disengage. But of course the refinery is there, and if it is to be used by any person or entity who comes with terms that the government can accept, then it will be considered. But this is one of many refineries around the world that has been closed because of the economics of refining oil. But of course the market changes. I mean, recently everybody was asking for more crude, more refined product and more diesel and so on. So these things are usually not permanent. They are driven by the market conditions, and because the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the taxpayer, is a small decision maker in it, we have to decide how much we profit or how much we lose in it. And that's why, and only the government has that responsibility. Other people could say all kinds of things, but the only entity that has the responsibility for making that decision in the public interest, the wider public interest, is the government of Trinidad and Tobago. You can make other decisions that serve private, sectoral, or individual interests, but that is not the wider public interest.
Prime Minister, on the situation of crime, treating it as a public health situation, what are your expectations that are going to be different now using this form of modelling, I'm assuming it is, as opposed to past studies that have been done? We've had the I.A.N report, and there was an initiative by Mr. Anthony Watkins that had begun, and I'm not sure. So what are your expectations?
I am not now talking about reports, I'm talking about action. The action plan that I'm anticipating, and as I told you, I'm open to being advised by the experts, is what do people do? And one of the things that we want to do is to train our young people in a way that they will be guided away from a violent life and a violent future, either as victims or as perpetrators.
Are there any parameters? Because it's such a broad thing. If we sat down here over a beer, we could come up with an idea, well, the family's breaking down, we need more Cub Scouts and Girl Guides, the church. There are so many ideas.
And that is precisely why we've put the team that I've mentioned. If you notice the number of ministries I mentioned, did I mention the ministries? Yes, and within those ministries are the responsibilities for the various components of that conversation over the beer, and also the responsibility for doing certain things or making certain interventions or charting certain courses. That's why we put them together, maybe over a glass of water at their meetings. But we need now to decide, is there anything we can do? What is the nature of the problem? How do we actually address the problem at the personal level? And what I am anticipating is that we'll address it at the personal level, at our individual youth, our individual young child, our individual schools, our individual households, our individual police districts, and it's a quite wide and broad tapestry of action. The aim is to squeeze the criminal behavior, the criminal conduct out of the lives of people. But to do so, you can't leave a vacuum. It has to be replaced with something else. Yes.
Hi, Charlie Rampersad from CNC3. How much money is going to be allocated towards this program that you're speaking about?
That would be answered when we see what the program is. But what we are aiming to do, hopefully, again, all of us who spend government money or talk about government expenditure know that there are limits to what the country could afford. But on this exercise, we hopefully will be able to find the resources, the reasonable resources, to make the interventions that could come out of this action plan.
Will you all be seeking international funding?
Yes, that's one of the things that we could probably do, because this is the kind of a national or societal issue that probably could attract the attention of some of the funding agencies, either to help in the preparation of it, the execution of it, and so on. So that's one of the things that we'll aim to do. When we get a proper action plan in place, identifiable and workable, then we expect to be able to fund it in however it is required to be funded.
And you spoke about this targeting the younger people, younger children and schools and all of that. We know a lot of the public concern over crime right now is to do with the crime that is happening right now. You spoke about meeting with the commissioner and other heads as head of the National Security Council. What assurances can you give the population?
Well, the assurance is that we are still maintaining the resources and the endeavor of the policemen and women who go out there every day and every night. We have a serious criminal element in our country, very well armed, very well supported. And by the way, having said that, I should tell you, I have just received the report of the examination of the firearms unit of the police service, which was being done by group of persons that you were told about before. And that report makes very disturbing reading, and notwithstanding the best efforts of some of my deranged parliamentary colleagues, I intend to send that report even before I finish reading it. I'm going to send it to the Police Service Commission and then let the chips fall where they may.
What can you share with us?
And there's an executive summary of it. It will be laid in the Parliament as soon as the Parliament is open. The executive summary, but all components of it will go to the Police Service Commission. Yes.
You have a follow-up
Well,
question, Charlie?
no, I think I thought my colleague
You sound confused.
was about to ask if there's anything that you've read thus far that you can reveal in any form or fashion concerning what you found.
I don't intend to treat the report in any piecemeal fashion like that. It will be laid in the Parliament. It will go to the Police Service Commission. It will go to the Police Commissioner. And what we have done is identify the nature of the problem. And as I said to you, there are serious problems in there.
Go to DPP at all?
You?
The Director of Public Prosecutions? Is there any?
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Sean, because for the nth and umpteenth time, let me say it in capital letters, the Director of Public Prosecution is not an investigative agent. The Director of Public Prosecution does not have investigative powers. So all these things you're always publishing about, go to the DPP, send to the DPP. The DPP is fed with work from the police service, and the authority to do investigation lie with the police service. And if they find criminal conduct, they then advance it to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution for guidance, for assistance, and for adjudication as to whether charges should be laid and so. But investigations, it looks good in the papers that something has gone to the DPP and this gone to the DPP. The DPP is not an investigative agent of the state, does not have investigative powers. If the DPP asks for an investigation of any situation of any person, it is the police service that the DPP asks to do that. And then the power of the DPP's office goes further now. It can commence a prosecution or end the prosecution. I don't know why we forever going on with this DPP story.
On another issue related to the issue of the management of the state's response to crime, you do have the process of a new police commissioner.
I have the what?
No, there's a process, if I understand, I'm going to search for a new police commissioner, if I'm not mistaken. Guy Griffith, the former commissioner, has...
Stop right there. I'm not spending any of my time talking about Guy Griffith. What we have on the Constitution is an independent commissioner. That commission's role is to deal with, including the hiring or firing or disciplining of a commissioner and the deputy commissioners. That's where we are. And we had some difficulties early on. Those difficulties were headed off by the appointment of a commission. The commission is in place doing its work, and I think we should let it do its work. And the fringe conversations are not really helpful.
Right, so what I was leading towards, at the end of that process by the commission, names do go to the parliament for affirmative resolution, if I have the term correctly. So the question really would have been, in other words then, by the government's majority, it has to be approved by parliament. So if Mr. Griffith's name were to be on
Why are you talking to me about Gary Griffith? We have 1.4 million citizens. The work of the commission applies to 1.4 million citizens. I have no idea who the commission will recommend to the parliament. And I have no idea at this point in time how the parliamentary decisions will go. So in a way, to be picking up the name of one individual and bringing it forward is just for effervescence of the day. It doesn't help the process. It just creates just this disturbance in the country, and any one person could just be disturbing the country's psyche. Let's go look at the beautiful flower, right? As in the rainy season, let's look at what's happening with the rains and so on. Enjoy the rain. People who identify themselves for daily treatment by the media and daily treatment by the... I'm not in that. I have a job to do. The commission will do its job, and there will come a time when the commission's work will become public, because it has to be sent to the president and to the parliament, and then the parliamentarians like myself will have a job to do then. So let's wait until that happens, and in the meantime, let us not upset ourselves by the prospect of Mr. This or Mr. That, and who just keeps stirring up discord. I really don't have any time for that.
In terms of your job, you did discuss in your meeting as head of the National Security Council, the head of the Defense Force, if I'm not mistaken, or representatives were there. I'm just wondering, was part of the discussions on the issue of crime, any greater role of the defense force or not?
The role of the defense force in support of the police service is established, and therefore I don't have to speak about greater or minor role. The defense force is in fact with the police service in this matter in more ways than one. What we're aiming to do is to do more of it and to be more successful, because the criminals seem not to have any restraint.
Prime Minister, hi, Kimberly from TTT News. Prime Minister, I know that the conversation was ongoing in terms of the criminal activity.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you clearly.
Can you hear me now, Prime Minister?
Yes, speak a little loudly.
Sure, Kimberly from TTT News. I know that the conversation was ongoing in terms of the criminal element and of course how serious crime is in the country. I was just wondering if any discussion took place in terms of the police, for want of a better word, involvement, in terms of how we now have 8 officers who would have been arrested for the murder of the 3 men in Mova. We have some other who of course are under investigations. We have the completed investigation about PC guilt. So any opinions or thoughts on that?
The first part of the question, yes. The question of the quality of the public service, the police service, and the treatment. I say it all the time, if there are people in the police service who do not measure up to the requirement of the uniform and the statute, then we implore the leaders of those services, not just the police service, I say to the Coast Guard, to the Defense Force, and I dare say it shouldn't be to the Teaching Service Commission, that they shouldn't be there. But in terms of speaking specifically to the ones that you mentioned, which are under trial now and investigations, I would not want to comment, because I want the process to operate without any misunderstanding of any comment that I might make.
But in terms of, Prime Minister, rogue officers within the police service?
Again, as I said, that is covered by me saying that if the leaders of those services find that there are people in there for whom action ought to be taken because they fall short of the requirement of their uniform or of the statute that give them the power that they have, they are encouraged to discourage them from being in there. I say no more on that. Now that should cover what you're asking me. But in terms of the specific charges against officers, understand that police officers too will be innocent until proven guilty. So it is not for me to pontificate on their guilt while the trial is taking place or the charge is being formulated or the investigation is taking place. I hope that we don't disregard time, but time is an important element in the step-by-step process. That's a requirement in these situations.
If we could shift gears for a little bit. A couple of weeks ago, you had a press conference. You spoke extensively about Caricom and food security in the region. Now, locally, the farmers here are saying that the government is not doing enough for them. They say the rising cost of fertilizers and different chemicals that they use in their production, it's forcing them to send their prices up, and that's in addition to seasonal rainfall. What can you say? Has the government had any discussions about a way forward to assist farmers?
The government in Trinidad and Tobago has this huge package of assistance for farmers. It is not that we are now being called upon to come out and assist farmers. But certainly, there's always a situation where you can do more, especially if the circumstances call for more. What is happening now is that the ministry is looking at exactly what impact the package that we have in place is having, and because those packages have been in place for so long, they clearly have not solved the problem or preserved us and protected us from situations. On the other hand, the current situation may require new initiatives. For example, this Caricom initiative talking about is a volume initiative where we are aiming to provide much of our food on the raw material side, the volume side, to be able to process it for consumption. Those food items that are not volume affected, like fresh vegetables and fruits and so, where you get the elements of sometimes some flooding, sometimes, well, we have situations in place where where assistance comes. What happens is that a lot of people take this assistance for granted. Some people don't even acknowledge it. But if you go to the ministry, you will see that we do spend millions of dollars every year, one way or the other, assisting the farming community. And I know for a fact, having been a minister of agriculture myself before, that you do not normally hear of the assistance that the state provides. I know you would have seen in some countries that assistance is now being mentioned for that country. And persons will get up and say, why you can't do it in Trinidad and Tobago? Check carefully. And you will see in Trinidad and Tobago that we're not just doing that, we've done more. Right? From land distribution, right? State land, assistance with managing state land, making agriculture tax free as an entity of business, importation, where you have tax reductions or removals on certain items. With respect to protection from flooding and so on, a significant amount of money spent every year in managing drainage and so on. But you will never be in a perfect situation where in the rainy season that nobody will be affected. We are so much in Trinidad and Tobago now where the typical rainy season, we have a dry season, so sometimes we suffer for water, and we have a rainy season. We are now so well positioned that every cloud that comes into this country, we get information well in advance, sometimes days in advance, to be careful with the coming cloud. And therefore, we now behave as though the rainy season is not part of our environmental exposure. We are exposed to the rainy season. What we should be doing, though, is being aware of the rainy season and what would be required for water to flow in our country, in watercourses and other places where water might be ponded, and ensure that in the dry season we don't either occupy those places, interfere with the free flow of water when water comes and so on, and that would somehow help, along with the other things that we are doing, to ensure that we get through the rainy season without too much distress and pain. But everywhere there is the possibility for improvement in the government action, and now we are re-examining the whole package of action that the government is doing. And we will see what additional help can be made available, because we really want an additional output if we are going to have food security and food availability.
And switching gears a little bit again, on Friday we saw the vote for two motions against the AG at the Law Association taking place, and both of those motions were defeated. You have any thoughts on that? Would you like to share?
No, I'm a geologist. Thank you very much.